On Saturday the 25th of November, just 2 weeks ago, a 25-year-old veteran and father of two named Jamell Lee Heung was spending the night with some friends when he would suddenly disappear without a trace. He was last seen at the Indian Head Naval Base in Maryland, where he lived with his wife and two young children, alongside many of his friends who were also based in the same area. It is still unknown what exactly happened that night, but at around 2 a.m, Jamell decided to leave the bar, likely heading back to his family, but strangely, he would never make it home. A missing persons report was made shortly after, and the Charles County Sheriff's Department would act after 48 hours, sending officers out to his last known whereabouts. However, after searching the surrounding area and sending divers into a nearby creek, they were soon mortified to discover Jamell's car submerged under the water. But to everyone's surprise, after continuing to search the creek, the divers were still unable to find any trace of Jamell himself. So, after 2 weeks of searching with no answers, many are starting to wonder, what really happened to Jamell Lee Heung, and who is responsible? Jamell Lee Heung II was born in 1998, along with his 6 sisters who he shared a close relationship with, and together they grew up on the East Coast of America. Growing up, he was always seen as a leader, and was somebody who his sisters would look up to with respect, so it was no surprise when he would eventually follow in his father's footsteps by joining the military at just 17 years old. Well, it would be safe to say, Jamell quickly adapted to his new surroundings, as he was almost immediately scouted as one of the stronger soldiers in his squad, and it was with this well-disciplined character that he would eventually go on to represent the military at both Fort Drum in New York and Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia. However, despite the positive character-building experience of the military, this didn't mean his life was easy, as Jamell would sometimes struggle with being away from home for too long, especially as he would later form a relationship with his soon-to-be wife, where they would eventually bring 2 beautiful children into the world. So as you can imagine, being a young father trying to raise 2 young boys whilst balancing a stressful career was always likely to take its toll, and so Jamell decided to leave his position within the military after 6 years of dedicated service. However, despite his decision, the military still offered the young father a place to live on the Indian Head Naval Base in Maryland, and so given that he had a young family to raise, Jamell and his wife were more than happy to accept. During this period, Jamell would often find himself at a loose end, given that he was no longer serving, and so I think it would be fair to say that he was likely still finding his feet with his new life. But it wasn't long before he would put his wasted energy to work by going back to education with the aim of receiving a bachelor's degree. As well as his studies, however, Jamell was also known to spend his free time assisting his family with odd jobs, as he was always happiest when he was helping out the people he loved. So, when Jamell suddenly decided to not return home one night, it didn't take long before everybody knew that something terrible must have happened. On Friday the 24th of November, Jamell had spent most of the day tirelessly working alongside his father-in-law with his landscaping business. It is unknown if he decided to drive home after this time, but what we do know is that Jamell eventually set off to meet his mother and stepfather later that day at a restaurant, and by all accounts, they enjoyed a pleasant dinner together before saying their goodbyes. According to my sources, Jamell then drove over to a local bar on Bryan's Road in Maryland, where he had planned to have a few drinks and listen to some live music with his friends. It is currently unknown how many drinks he had that night, but due to his very busy day, it wasn't too surprising to see that he would eventually fall asleep at his table, and with closing time quickly approaching, the staff had no choice but to wake Jamell up and send him home. But surprisingly, it would seem that his friends had already left, so the staff were then forced to help the groggy man to his car, and watched him climb inside, before he drove off down the road, en route to his home back on the naval base. He then made his way to the security gates, but to the shock of the guards, they noticed that his car was leaking fluids and had 2 flat tyres. so given the regulations at the time, they were forced to refuse him entry. However, little did they know at the time that this would be the last official sighting of Jamell Lee Heung. On Saturday the 25th of November, Jamell's family were seriously concerned when they awoke to find that the young man had not returned home as planned. At the time, they had no reason to believe that he would be staying over at a friend's house, so with this in mind, his family then began calling everybody who knew Jamell, hoping that they had recently spoken to him and perhaps knew where he was. However, to their dismay, Jamell's friends also had no idea where he could be, as they explained that the last time they saw him he was at the bar and they hadn't really heard from him since. So, with nowhere else to turn, Jamell's family felt that they had no other option than to call the Charles County Sheriff's Office to officially report him as a missing person. But to their shock, despite quickly finding clear evidence of a trail of liquid leading directly into Mattawoman Creek, the police refused to act, as before they could inspect the water, they first needed to establish whose jurisdiction the location belonged to. So with the investigation being delayed, Jamell's family were forced to wait an agonizing 48 hours before the police finally made their decision. On Monday the 27th of November, the local authorities finally started their official search of the Mattawoman Creek, hoping to find any sign of the missing young man to bring some closure to his family. After all, given that he was last seen near the naval base, the sheriff's department were concerned that he may have accidentally ended up in the water, especially given the trail of liquid which harrowingly led directly to the creek. So, with this thought in mind, they requested that the Naval Criminal Investigation Service assist in the search, as there was a strong possibility that Jamell may have been met with foul play. And then, soon after they arrived on the scene, one of the divers noticed something at the bottom of the creek and called over his colleague for further assessment. They had found what appeared to be some kind of wreckage, and after inspecting it closer, they finally realized it was a badly damaged vehicle. So, with this interesting discovery, they then came back up to the surface and immediately told the investigators about what they had seen. But to their horror, after describing the vehicle as best as they could, it soon became clear that this car belonged to none other than Jamell Lee Heung. The car was then pulled out of the water, understandably being met with desperate eyes, as his father could do nothing but watch and wait to see if his son was inside. After all, given the circumstances, it wasn't hard to presume the worst. However, to everyone's surprise, after opening the car doors, they would soon discover that there was no one inside. On Tuesday the 28th of November, the Naval Criminal Investigation Service returned to the scene, with fresh eyes, ready to search the creek for further evidence. At this point in time, the police knew that with Jamell's vehicle being found in the creek, there was a very good chance his body may still be in there as well. But interestingly, during their search the day before, they were unable to find Jamell's body anywhere in the surrounding waters, and so were eventually forced to give up for the day. So, with a truly horrible task on their hands, the divers submerged themselves once again the following day to see if they could find any other useful evidence. But once again, to everybody's astonishment, despite the clear evidence that something must have happened to Jamell in that creek, days of searching would continue to come up empty, and so, with each passing day, the likelihood of his deceased body being found in the water was becoming slimmer and slimmer. However, this wasn't necessarily bad news for Jamell's family, as they were rightfully holding out hope that he was still alive out there somewhere. So with tenacity in their heads and optimism in their hearts, they took to the media to plead with the public for any assistance in finding their missing son. The story was thankfully picked up by a few news networks, notably WUSA 9, who took the time to speak with Jamell's father directly, and awareness was raised in the hopes that this would lead to a potential sighting of Jamell. But despite the huge efforts of everyone involved, to this day, every single lead discovered so far in this case is still yet to provide any answers, with both Jamell's family and the authorities failing to find any further evidence to explain what really happened to the young father of two. Now, unfortunately, this is all we know for now, but given the incredibly strange details surrounding Jamell's case, it would appear there is a lot more to the story, just waiting to be uncovered. However, given that the young man has now been missing for almost 2 weeks, his safe return is starting to look more and more unlikely as the days pass. So, with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before I start diving into the theories themselves, I think a question we need to ask ourselves first is how exactly did Jamell's car actually end up in that creek? It is truly a mystery, and with the car seeming to be wrecked beforehand, you would assume there had to have been something nefarious going on. I know accidents happen, and I suppose it's plausible that Jamell was driving under the influence of something, or maybe he was just overtired and accidentally crashed his car and then drove it into the creek. But the key details that strongly contest this explanation are that his body wasn't found in the vehicle, and there's no way his car would have got as damaged as it was simply from colliding with the water. In my opinion, it is pretty much guaranteed that Jamell's car was totaled before it ended up in the creek, which then poses the question, how did it get so damaged, and who is responsible? Well, one route that you could take would be to contemplate whether or not Jamell had any enemies on that naval base. As I mentioned earlier, Jamell was a military veteran and lived on the naval base with his family. So given that he was last seen here, it wouldn't be a huge leap to say that he could have got into a heated exchange with a fellow veteran, who then tried to cover up his crimes by ditching the car and hiding Jamell's body. To further back this theory, you could also argue that the suspect would have had to have known precisely where to drive the car into the creek, where there were no cameras. As far as I'm aware, no CCTV footage has been revealed or discussed, so I would be inclined to believe there is no such evidence of the car going into the creek. Perhaps I am mistaken here, but I would assume that an area located nearby to a naval base would be swarmed with security cameras, so the fact that we have no proof of the car going into the creek would imply that whoever did it didn't want to be seen. However, another angle you could also go down would be to raise suspicion on one of Jamell's friends. After all, they appear to have left him all alone at a bar, which to me seems like very strange behaviour. Could one of his friends have potentially spiked his drink that night? It would certainly explain why the staff let him drive home, as they surely wouldn't have let him drive if they had seen him drinking alcohol all night. A theory could be that the bartenders knew he had only had 1 or 2 beers, and so this could explain why they were so confident he wasn't drunk but just tired, therefore allowing him to drive home. Either way, I'd still say the staff acted incredibly unprofessional to allow such a situation to take place. As far as I'm concerned, regardless of what they thought at the time, they should have never let a man who was sleeping in their bar 5 minutes earlier drive himself home. But to be fair, Jamell did manage to drive 7 miles and convinced a security guard that he was safe to drive his car away from the naval base after they denied him entry, so he must have been somewhat coherent. However, taking a step back to pose another much more controversial theory, what if the story of Jamell speaking to the security guard didn't even happen? After all, this is the only evidence to point in the direction that Jamell got into a car crash before arriving at the naval base. So, could it be possible that somebody is hiding something? Now, just to quickly preface this particular theory, I would just like to say that I have absolutely no evidence to prove this, and it is solely an expression of my own personal thoughts. But this certainly wouldn't be the first time a police department has tried to cover up a crime. On this channel, I have covered several cases where the police have provided the bare minimum in terms of assistance, and with Jamell's case, it would seem the same treatment is being issued here. How they haven't been able to provide any updates in almost 2 weeks is beyond me, especially given we are talking about a veteran and a father of 2 young children who also disappeared near a supposedly ultra-secure naval base. Also, to add to this point, the police didn't start their official search of the creek until almost 48 hours after Jamell was first reported missing, which regardless of policy seems extremely suspicious to me. But saying this, if the crime has been covered up by the police, what would have been their motive? Well, it's no secret that Maryland has an extremely dark history, and with Jamell being a person of colour, it's certainly possible that he could have been targeted by a racially motivated individual. Perhaps the suspect isn't directly linked to the authorities exactly, but the fact that the police seem to be staying very quiet about this case could imply that they are not taking it seriously, which, if we're being honest, is a situation I highly doubt would be the same if it were a white person that had gone missing. Now, once again, let me just say that these points are merely my own personal thoughts and have absolutely no real evidence-backed basis, but I still think they are relevant to consider, especially given the shady past of the state of Maryland. But saying this, if the crime wasn't racially motivated, why else would the police cover up this crime? Well, maybe it's very simple. What if the person responsible is tightly connected to the police department? So in an attempt to keep their name out of headlines and to keep a particular person out of prison, they are staying very quiet about Jamell's case. But either way, until we have more evidence, we can only continue to speculate. As who knows, maybe the police do have camera footage, or even a prime suspect in mind, but are simply choosing to stay quiet until they have more conclusive evidence. However, if the police aren't responsible, and we also rule out the possibility of Jamell being murdered by somebody he knew, how else could we explain his strange disappearance? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it is highly unlikely that he simply drove into the water by mistake, as his body wasn't found in the vehicle. I suppose it's possible that after the car went in he could have climbed out, but then again, his father believes that the vehicle was so badly damaged that this had to have happened before it ended up in the water. Also, if he managed to escape the sinking car, why is Jamell even a missing person at all? Surely he would have been able to swim to safety given his extensive training in the military. Another point to add is that even if he was so incapacitated at the time of the accident that he was completely unable to swim, why have the divers not been able to find his body for almost 2 weeks? In my opinion, the very fact that we are still unable to answer any of these questions is extremely suspicious, and to me, the likelihood that this was just a simple self-inflicted accident is questionable at best. So with this thought in mind, if Jamell wasn't responsible for driving his car into the creek, and we also can't blame a local resident or the police, who else could it be? Well, there are countless theories you could delve into, ranging from human trafficking to organ harvesting and everything in between. But based on the evidence, there really isn't much to go off. Perhaps this is due to the police acting so slowly when Jamell was first reported missing, or maybe the case really is just incredibly mysterious and difficult to solve. But either way, I truly hope the authorities continue investigating, in the hopes they can provide some further updates and detailed answers to Jamell's family. Because to be honest with you, from my experience in researching these cases, it wouldn't surprise me if the police eventually concocted a story where the young man decided to leave his family behind due to the pressures of his life. But given Jamell's devotion to his family, I would personally put this theory right at the bottom of the pile, as even if that was the case, after 2 weeks of searching, I'm sure the police would have been able to find something alluding to this theory by now. But just before I end the video, I also wanted to mention one last thing to provide some further context as to why I think Jamell's case is so important. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, then you know I have discussed several other missing person cases where all that is ever found is the victim's car. Jared Shadid is one example that comes to mind, who is another person of colour that suddenly disappeared back in July and has now been missing for almost 5 months, with only his car ever being recovered. But perhaps a more accurate case to highlight would be the disappearance of Daniel Robinson, who once again was another young person of colour that disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and just like Jamell, the only evidence ever found was his wrecked car with no body present. In addition to this, despite the extremely suspicious details surrounding Daniel's case, he never got the media coverage or the investigation he deserved, which in my opinion is most likely why he was never located. Also, why do the media and the police always seem to move on so quickly? I somewhat understand the news broadcasters as they have ratings to meet and shareholders to impress, but I could never comprehend why the police also seem to share this narrative by investigating some cases more than others. The fact is, Jamell has been missing for almost 2 weeks, and I'm still yet to see any major news networks cover the story, which I believe is due to the lack of information being provided by the authorities. So in my opinion, this entire situation is an absolute travesty, but despite the rather bleak circumstances, I will try to hold out hope that Jamell's case does not follow the same pattern as Daniel's. So with this in mind, I wholeheartedly urge you all to please do everything you can to help Jamell's family in their search for their loved one, because I fear that if we don't, nobody else will. Anyway, with that, I think I'll leave this video here, but if you have any theories of your own that you would like to discuss, please leave your ideas in the comment section below, and I will do my best to get back to you. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any case updates. Also, if you found this video interesting, make sure to check out the playlist on screen now, where I've covered a range of similar cases, including the equally suspicious disappearance of Daniel Robinson.